Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiast. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always excited to explore these rich ideas.
Today we're tackling John Locke's perspective on freedom.
One of the cornerstones of his philosophy, really.
And it's got some interesting twists and turns, right?
More than a few, yeah.
We're drawing primarily from the Locke on freedom entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
A really comprehensive and authoritative resource.
For sure. So the mission here is to unpack what Locke really means when he talks about being free.
Especially his views on the will and its role, which can be a bit surprising.
Yeah, ready to maybe have some of your philosophical assumptions challenged a bit?
I think that comes with the territory, right?
Absolutely. So, diving right in, one of the first things that jumps out is Locke's focus on actions and what he calls forbearances.
Right, the whole doing or not doing something aspect of freedom.
Okay, so let's break that down. From what I gather, Locke seems to have a few different ways of thinking about what an action even is.
Yeah, there's this straightforward, everyday notion of doing, actively initiating something.
Like reaching for a cup of coffee.
Exactly. But then there's the composite view, where an action involves both a mental and a physical component.
So like, I have the thought, I want coffee, and then my hand reaches out.
Precisely. The mental volition leading to the physical manifestation. But the really interesting one, the one that seems most central to Locke, is the deflationary conception.
Yeah, this is where it gets a bit more, well, philosophical. So how does that work?
Basically, the deflationary view boils down actions to just two fundamental categories. Movements of bodies or operations of minds.
So any physical movement, even if it's like a reflex, would count as an action.
That's right. Locke himself gives the example of convulsive motions.
Oh, interesting. So even if I'm not consciously willing my arm to jerk, it's still an action for Locke.
Exactly. It's about the movement itself, not necessarily the conscious intention behind it. This is a big difference from some other philosophical views, right?
For sure. Okay, so we have actions pretty broadly defined. And then there are these forbearances. Now, at first glance, you might think of those as like actively choosing not to do something.
Yeah, a conscious decision to refrain.
But the text points out that Locke also talks about involuntary forbearances. How does that fit in?
That's where the deflationary lens comes in again. A forbearance, in this context, is essentially the absence of an action or thought.
So it could just be a state of rest, either physically or mentally.
Right. If I forbear from running, it just means I didn't run. It doesn't necessarily mean I made a conscious decision not to.
I see. So sometimes it's a choice, sometimes it's not. It's just about the lack of that action or thought.
Exactly. And Locke himself even says he'll often just use the term action to cover both actions and forbearances.
Yes.
Keeps things simpler.
Right. Highlights that they're being treated in a similar way. Okay, so we've got this groundwork laid, what counts as an action and a forbearance. Now let's get into the will, because that seems pretty central to Locke's whole concept of freedom.
Absolutely. The will is the engine of agency, right?
And from what I read, it seems like Locke's thinking on the will actually evolved over time.
Yeah, that's a key point. In his early work, he had what's called a desiderative view of the will.
So basically, the will is all about what we desire, what we want most.
More specifically, it's about preferring one thing over another based on how much pleasure we anticipate it will bring. So willing something is basically just being drawn towards that option because it seems more pleasurable.
Makes sense on the surface. But then the text mentions that Locke himself starts to see some problems with this view.
Right, and he gives that great example of preferring to fly rather than to walk. I mean, who wouldn't want to fly, right?
For sure. So I might really desire to fly, but that doesn't mean I will it to happen, especially if I know it's impossible.
Exactly. And that's where the early view starts to break down. Just wanting something, no matter how intensely, doesn't necessarily translate into a will to make it happen, especially if you don't believe it's actually possible.
Right, so the desire alone isn't enough. So what does Locke do? How does he revise his thinking?
So in his later work, he shifts to what's called a directive or commanding faculty view of the will.
Okay, so instead of just passively wanting things, the will now has a more active directing role.
Exactly. Now, the will is seen as this power we have to initiate, stop, continue, or refrain from actions, both mental and physical.
Just by thinking about it, by making that decision.
Right, by directing our thoughts towards a specific action or forbearance.
So it's about consciously exerting this power of the will to make things happen or to prevent them from happening.
Exactly. And it's crucial to note that Locke now distinguishes this from mere desiring.
Okay, so even though I might desire something strongly, I can still choose to will something different.
Right. You might desire pain relief if you've got a bad case of gout, for example.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
But you might still will yourself to endure it if you believe that taking something for immediate relief would ultimately make things worse.
So the will is making the judgment call based on what's best in the long run, even if it means going against a strong desire in the moment.
Exactly. That's the key difference between this later view and the earlier one. It's not just about what we want most right now. It's about this conscious, directing power we have over our actions.
Okay, so now that we've got a better grasp on how Locke understands the will, let's move on to how he differentiates between voluntary and involuntary actions. I'm guessing this is where volition, the act of willing, comes into play.
Absolutely. According to Locke's later definition, a voluntary action or forbearance is one that's a direct result of a volition. Basically, it's something we do or refrain from doing because we consciously willed it to be so.
Makes sense. So what about involuntary actions?
Well, those are the actions that happen without that guiding thought, that conscious act of willing.
So things we do without thinking, reflexes, that kind of thing.
Right, exactly.
The text mentions something about a causal link between willing and voluntary action. What's that about?
Yeah, so Locke seems to be suggesting that an act of willing typically causes the voluntary action to happen, unless something gets in the way.
Like if I will myself to pick up a book, but then the book's glued to the table or something.
Precisely. My will is there, but some external factor prevents the action from taking place.
Interesting. The text also briefly mentions this idea of deviant causation. What's that?
Oh, yeah, that's a really complex philosophical problem. It's about those weird situations where a volition might set off a chain of events that ultimately leads to an action, but in a totally bizarre and unexpected way.
Okay, can you give an example?
Well, imagine I will myself to scratch my nose, but somehow that action ends up triggering a Rube Goldberg machine that ultimately launches a rocket into space. My intention was just to scratch my nose, but it ends up having this completely unintended consequence.
Wow, yeah, that's definitely deviant. So the question then becomes, is that rocket launch still a voluntary action on my part?
Exactly. It gets really tricky. And from what I understand, the text suggests that Locke might not have addressed this specific issue head on.
Okay, so maybe a future deep dive topic. Now, the text mentions a classic philosophical thought experiment, the locked room scenario.
Ah, yes, a favorite for illustrating these subtle points about volition and freedom.
So remind us, how does that scenario go?
Imagine someone is carried into a room while they're asleep, and in that room is someone they really, really want to see.
Okay, sounds intriguing.
So they wake up, they're delighted to be there, and they choose to stay and chat, totally unaware that the door is locked.
So they think they're free to leave, but they're actually not.
Exactly. But here's the key point. Locke argues that their staying in the room is still a voluntary forbearance to leave.
Really? But they literally can't leave.
Right. But their will is perfectly aligned with their actions. They want to stay and talk, and that's what they're doing.
So even though the external circumstances restrict their actual ability to leave, the choice they're making in that moment is still considered voluntary.
Precisely. It highlights that for Locke, the focus is on the alignment between the will and the action, even if there are unseen constraints at play.
That makes sense. The text also mentions this concept of overdetermination. What's that about?
Oh, right. So in this scenario, you could argue that there are two sufficient causes for the person staying in the room: their own volition to stay and the fact that the door is locked. Both would lead to the same outcome, even if one of them were absent.
Ah, I see. So it's overdetermined because there are two separate factors that could each independently explain the result.
Exactly. It's a subtle point, but it highlights the complexity of untangling causality and volition in these scenarios.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so we talked about actions, the will, voluntary versus involuntary. Let's finally get to Locke's actual definition of freedom itself. From what I understand, he sees it as a kind of two-way power that agents possess.
You got it. Locke defines freedom or liberty, he uses the terms interchangeably, as this ability to either perform an action or refrain from performing it based on what we will.
So I'm free if I can do what I want and not do what I don't want.
Precisely. He emphasizes that this freedom belongs to the agent, to the person, not to the volitions themselves. It's about our capacity to act in accordance with our will.
So to use a simple example, if I want to raise my hand, I'm free to do so as long as I have the ability to both raise it and to keep it down if I so choose.
Exactly. It's that two-way power that matters. And the text brings back the locked room and the falling person examples to show what a lack of freedom looks like. In those cases, one of those two necessary conditions isn't met.
Right, because in the locked room, I can't leave even if I want to, and if I'm falling, I can't just choose to stop midair.
Precisely. And this brings us to the concept of necessity, which Locke contrasts with freedom.
So if freedom is the ability to do what I will, necessity would be the opposite, being compelled to act in a certain way regardless of my will.
Exactly. For Locke, necessity describes the condition of being unfree.
The text also cautions against a simplistic understanding of Locke's idea of power. It's not just about counterfactuals, right?
Right. It's not just about what would happen if you willed something, but about your actual ability to make it happen. The text gives a couple of interesting examples to illustrate this. One involves a daughter and her father.
Okay, curious.
Imagine a daughter who playfully commands her father to raise his arm, and he does so just to humor her.
So his arm goes up, but it's not because he willed it to.
Exactly. It's not a voluntary action on his part, but he still has freedom with respect to his arm rising because he could raise it if he wanted to, and he could keep it still if he wanted to.
Right, so he still possesses that two-way power, even though in this instance, his arm is moving due to his daughter's command?
Precisely. And then there's the example of the paralyzed person.
Okay, what about them?
So a paralyzed person might choose to stay still, but they lack the power to move even if they willed to.
Right, so they lack that crucial two-way power that defines freedom for Locke.
Exactly. This really underscores that for Locke, voluntariness and freedom are two distinct concepts.
Yeah.
Just because I'm doing something voluntarily doesn't automatically mean I'm free to do otherwise.
Interesting distinction. And the text mentions that Locke extends this analysis to mental actions as well.
Right. So we might have the freedom to combine certain ideas in our minds at will, but we might lack the freedom to just dismiss a feeling of pain, like if we were being tortured on the rack.
Intense example, but it makes sense.
Oh.
So after all this groundwork, Locke makes a rather bold claim. He says that the traditional philosophical question of whether the will itself is free is actually a nonsensical question.
Okay, he doesn't mince words, does he?
Not at all. So why does he dismiss this whole debate about free will as improper or even absurd?
Well, his reasoning flows directly from how he's defined things so far. Remember, he sees the will as a power to direct actions.
Right, and freedom is also the power to act or not act according to our will.
Exactly. But for Locke, powers are always attributes of substances of agents. They're not things that can themselves possess powers.
Okay, so I can have the power to run because I'm a physical being, an agent, but running itself, the action, doesn't have any powers.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So to ask if the will is free is, for Locke, like asking if sleep can be swift or virtue can be square. It's just a category mistake. You're attributing a property to something that can't logically have that property.
I see. So the will is just a faculty, a capacity that I possess. It's not some independent entity that can be free or unfree.
Exactly. So for Locke, the whole debate about free will is just a misunderstanding of what the will actually is.
That's a pretty elegant way to sidestep a centuries-old philosophical quagmire. But the text points out that Locke doesn't just stop there. He reformulates the whole question about freedom and the will into two more specific and, in his view, meaningful inquiries.
Right. Instead of getting bogged down in whether the will itself is free, he asks, are agents free with respect to willing one way or another? Mm-hmm. And are agents free with respect to willing a particular action?
Okay, let's unpack those. So the first one, freedom with respect to willing one way or another, what's that about?
Is basically asking, when we're faced with a choice, do we have the freedom to not will a particular option? Can we avoid making a decision one way or the other?
Interesting. And what about the second question, freedom with respect to willing a particular action?
That one gets at whether we can, in essence, will what we will.
Sounds a bit circular. Like, isn't willing something inherently the same as being able to will it?
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky. And the text points out that there's actually some debate among Locke scholars about how he answers these two reformulated questions. But the dominant interpretation, particularly when you look at his earlier work, is that he answers both in the negative.
Okay, so he's saying that we're not free in those two respects. Let's break that down a bit more. What's his reasoning for saying we lack freedom with respect to willing one way or another?
Right. So Locke argues that once an action is proposed to our minds, we're kind of locked into willing either for it or against it.
How so?
Well, he says either that action is going to happen or it's not. If it happens, it's because we willed it to happen. If it doesn't happen, it's because we willed it not to happen. There's no third option.
So it's like a forced choice scenario. Either I will to eat this cookie or I will to not eat it.
Precisely. And from this, he concludes that we're not actually free in the act of willing itself. Once that action is presented to our minds, our will is going to be determined one way or the other.
Okay, so no escaping the cookie dilemma. But then the text mentions that Leibniz, another philosopher, steps in with a critique. He brings up the idea of suspending choice.
Yeah, Leibniz points out that we often have the ability to just postpone making a decision. It's not always a case of immediately willing yes or no.
So the cookie might just sit there on the table while I ponder my options.
Exactly. The non-occurrence of the action me eating the cookie might simply be because I haven't yet willed anything either way. I've suspended my choice.
Interesting. And how does Locke respond to this critique?
Well, what's really interesting is that Locke actually incorporates this idea of suspending choice into his later work. He calls it the doctrine of suspension.
Okay, so he's acknowledging that we do have this ability to pause, to delay the satisfaction of our desires.
Exactly. And during this period of suspension, the will isn't yet fixed on a particular course of action.
Which seems to create a bit of tension with his earlier argument that we necessarily will one way or another, right?
Yeah, on the surface, it seems like there might be an inconsistency there. But the text highlights a crucial refinement that Locke makes in his later work. He adds a very important qualifier to his answer about freedom with respect to willing.
Okay, what's the qualifier?
He now says that we're not free with respect to willing an action once it's proposed to our thoughts as presently to be done.
So it's not about any proposed action, but specifically those actions that we're considering for immediate execution.
Exactly. He gives the example of a man who's walking and is suddenly asked to stop right now.
Yeah.
In that moment, he has to either will to stop or will to continue walking. There's no time for deliberation, no space for suspension.
Right, it's an immediate decision that needs to be made.
But if the man is just sitting and someone proposes that he stand up, well, he probably has the option to postpone making that decision.
So it's about the timing, whether the action is being proposed for right now or for some future point.
Exactly. So Locke's refined position seems to be that this necessity of willing one way or another only applies to those situations where we're already engaged in a process and we need to decide whether to continue it or stop it right now.
Okay, so I have more freedom to choose when I'll start doing something, but once I'm in the middle of doing it, it's harder to suspend that decision to stop or continue.
Right. For future actions, especially those that aren't yet in progress, that power of suspension comes into play.
Got it. That makes a lot more sense and seems to address Leibniz's critique. The text also mentions a possible second restriction to Locke's necessity argument. Something about ongoing processes versus mere states. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the idea is that this necessity of willing might apply most strongly to actions that are already ongoing. Like in that walking example, the guy is already in the process of walking.
Right, so deciding to stop or continue is about whether to change that ongoing process.
Exactly, but if you're just sitting still, that's a state, not a process.
So if someone suggests that I stand up, I might have more freedom to suspend that decision because I'm not already engaged in the process of standing.
Precisely. It's a subtle distinction, but it seems to be part of Locke's more nuanced view in his later work.
Okay, so to summarize, Locke is basically saying that we have a certain degree of freedom when it comes to future actions, especially those that aren't already underway. We can choose to suspend our judgment to delay the decision, but when it comes to actions that are already in progress and that need an immediate decision about whether to stop or continue, that freedom is more limited. It's like we're bound to will one way or another in those cases.
That's a great summary. It shows how Locke is trying to find that balance between recognizing the power of the will and acknowledging those situations where our freedom might be constrained.
Makes sense. Okay, now let's tackle that second reformulated question that Locke poses. Freedom to will. This one seems to be a bit of a head-scratcher.
It definitely is. It's the kind of question that can really make you question the very way you think about these concepts.
So how does Locke frame this second question?
He asks whether a person is at liberty to will which of two options they please. Like, let's say, the option of moving or the option of staying still. Can I freely choose which one I want to will?
Yeah, already my brain is starting to hurt a little. And what's the prevailing interpretation here? Does Locke think we have this kind of freedom to will what we will?
Well, the majority view, drawing on some of Locke's own statements, suggests that he answers no. He talks about the absurdity of the question and even says that liberty concerns, not the will.
Okay, so on the surface, it seems like he's saying we don't have this kind of freedom. But then the text presents an alternative interpretation, one that argues Locke might actually be saying yes.
Right, there's a minority view that thinks Locke might be answering in the affirmative.
Hmm. But how do they reconcile that with his statements about the question being absurd?
Well, they point out that Locke goes on to explain what he means by that absurdity.
Yeah.
He says that asking if we're at liberty to will motion or rest is like asking if someone can will what they will.
Or like, be pleased with what pleases them.
Exactly. And on the face of it, those questions seem to have obvious, even trivial answers. Of course, whatever I end up willing, it must be the case that I can will it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be willing it.
Right, so it's like the very fact that I am willing something implies that I had the ability to will it. It becomes a kind of tautology.
Precisely. So the alternate interpretation suggests that Locke might be saying the question is absurd. Not because the answer is no, but because the answer is so obviously yes that it's not even worth debating.
Ah, that's an interesting twist. It's absurd because it's so self-evidently true that it shouldn't even be a question. I like that reading.
Me too. Has a certain elegance to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it aligns with his emphasis on powers belonging to agents. If I, as an agent, have the power to will, then it follows that I can will whatever I will, even if that seems a bit circular at first glance.
Right, so it's less about a separate freedom to will and more about the inherent nature of what it means to have the power of willing in the first place.
Exactly. Now, to make things even more interesting, Locke throws in a comment about an infinite regress of wills.
Oh, yeah, that sounds fun. What's that about?
He observes that if we make a big deal out of this question of whether we're free to will, then we're forced to imagine a whole chain of wills, one will determining another and so on, forever.
Okay, I can see how that would get messy fast.
Right. And the traditional interpretation sees this infinite regress as an argument against the freedom to will. It's like saying, if our wills are just determined by other wills, then we're not really free at all.
Makes sense. But how does the alternative affirmative interpretation deal with this infinite regress?
Well, for them, this infinite regress isn't a problem at all. It's more like a critique of those who think there's even a genuine question here. If willing to will something is basically just the same as willing it, then this whole chain of wills collapses. There's no infinite regress because it never even gets started.
Ah, I see. So it's like Locke is saying, if you think there's a real dilemma here, you're the one stuck with this absurd idea of an endless chain of wills.
Exactly. It's a subtle point, but it really highlights the different ways of reading Locke on this issue.
This is so fascinating. It's like every layer we peel back reveals another layer of complexity. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what Locke thinks actually determines the will. What drives our choices? And again, it seems his thinking evolved on this point.
Absolutely. This is a crucial part of his theory of freedom. In his early work, Locke aligns with a pretty classic hedonistic view. He argues that the will is always determined by what appears to be the greater good.
So we're always drawn to what we think will bring us the most pleasure.
Right. And he even equates good and evil with pleasure and pain, respectively. So it's all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain.
Sounds pretty straightforward. But then, as always, there's a wrinkle. The text mentions that Locke's friend Molyneux raises an important objection.
Yeah, Molyneux challenges this view on ethical grounds. He asks, if our choices are always determined by what we perceive as the greater good, how can we be held responsible for our sins?
Right, if I genuinely believe that stealing a cookie will bring me more good than bad, how can I be blamed for doing it?
Exactly. And Molyneux points out that people often make bad choices due to ignorance or misjudgment. They might not fully grasp the consequences of their actions.
So this simple idea of always being drawn to the greater good doesn't seem to capture the complexity of moral decision-making.
Right. It doesn't leave much room for genuine moral responsibility. And this critique seems to have had a real impact on Locke. In his later work, he revises his view of what determines the will.
Okay, so what's the new answer? What's the driving force behind our choices in this revised version?
He now argues that the will is always determined by some uneasiness.
Uneasiness. What exactly does he mean by that?
He defines uneasiness as any sort of pain that we experience, either in our bodies or in our minds.
So it could be physical pain, like a headache, or it could be emotional distress, like anxiety.
Exactly. And he uses this really interesting mechanistic language when he talks about uneasiness. He says these uneasinesses move the mind and push us to seek their removal.
So it's not just that we're passively drawn to pleasure, but that we're actively trying to escape discomfort
Right. It's like this constant push to get away from anything that feels bad, whether it's physical or mental.
Interesting. The text suggests that Locke offers both empirical observations and reasoned arguments to support this view. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so he talks about, for example, the indolent man. This is someone who recognizes that certain things are good for them, but they just lack the motivation to pursue them.
So even though they might see the greater good in, say, exercising or eating healthy, they just can't seem to get themselves to do it.
Exactly. And Locke argues that this is because they're not experiencing enough uneasiness to spur them into action. They're comfortable in their indolence, even if it's not ultimately in their best interest.
Interesting. What other examples does he use?
Well, he also talks about the drunkard. This is someone who knows that drinking too much is bad for them, but they still can't resist the urge.
Ah, the classic struggle of acrasia, knowing what's best but still doing the opposite.
Precisely. And Locke argues that this is because the immediate uneasiness of craving outweighs the more distant and abstract knowledge of the harm that drinking will cause.
So in that moment, the urge to satisfy that craving is just more powerful than the abstract knowledge of the negative consequences.
Right. And he uses this to argue that we're ultimately driven by whatever uneasiness is most pressing in the moment, not necessarily by some rational calculation of the greater good.
Okay, so it's not that we're irrational, but that our will is shaped by these more immediate and visceral experiences of discomfort. What other arguments does he make?
Well, he also points out that everyone desires happiness. It's like this universal human drive.
For sure.
But if we were always perfectly rational and always chose the greater good, then we should all be consistently pursuing those things that will bring us lasting happiness, like, say, cultivating virtue or striving for a place in heaven.
Right, because those are the ultimate goods, the things that would bring us true and lasting happiness.
Exactly. But Locke observes that people often fail to do this. We get distracted by more immediate and fleeting pleasures, even if they ultimately lead us further away from true happiness.
So his argument is that if the greater good was the sole determinant of our will, then we should all be saints by now. But since we're not, there must be something else at play, and that something else is uneasiness.
Precisely. It's this constant pressure from discomfort that shapes our choices more than we might realize. It's not that we're never motivated by the greater good, but that our will is also heavily influenced by these more immediate and often visceral experiences of uneasiness.
Okay, so it's a much more complex and perhaps even a bit more pessimistic view of human motivation than his earlier view. But it also seems to resonate more with our lived experience, right?
I think so, yeah. We all know the struggle of trying to resist temptation, of knowing what we should do but finding ourselves pulled in a different direction by our desires, our fears, our anxieties. Locke's later view seems to capture that struggle in a way that his earlier view doesn't quite manage.
For sure. But this raises a big question. If our will is ultimately determined by these uneasinesses, which we don't always have direct control over, how can we be considered truly free? And how can we be held morally responsible for our actions if those actions are just the product of these external forces pushing and pulling us in different directions? This seems like a pretty deterministic view of human behavior.
You're hitting on a really crucial point, and it's here that Locke's doctrine of suspension becomes absolutely essential.
Right, that idea that we have the power to hit the pause button, to delay acting on our immediate impulses.
Exactly. While Locke argues that uneasiness is what ordinarily determines the will, he also emphasizes that we have this capacity to suspend the satisfaction of our desires. We can, in essence, step back from the immediate pull of those uneasinesses and choose not to act on them right away.
So even though I might be feeling a really strong urge to do something driven by hunger, anxiety, whatever, I have the power to say, hold on, I'm not going to act on that just yet.
Precisely. And during that period of suspension, the will isn't yet fixed. It hasn't yet settled on a specific course of action. This gives us the opportunity to reflect, to deliberate, to weigh our options more carefully.
To think about the potential consequences of our actions, both positive and negative.
Right. We can ask ourselves, is this really what I want? Is this the best course of